The air in the city was thick with the smell of exhaust and dust as Dapo loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of his black SUV. It was the 20th of December, and he and his family were preparing for their trip to the village, where they planned to celebrate Christmas with relatives. His wife, Bissy, was on edge, an uncomfortable feeling gnawing at her. She had expressed her reservations about leaving on the 20th, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread about their timing. "Can't we just wait one more day?" she asked, watching him close the trunk. Dapo waved her off, irritated. "You're overthinking, Bissy. It's just a journey. There's nothing to worry about." "But I don't feel good about it," she insisted, her voice soft but pleading. Dapo turned and looked at her with impatience. "We're going today, whether you like it or not. Stop being superstitious. I'm in control here, and I've decided." Bissy fell silent, swallowing her discomfort. She knew better than to argue with him when he got like this. He was a proud man, and once he'd made up his mind, nothing could change it. They loaded the children, Sad, Kemi, and little Toby, into the back seat, and Dapo started the engine, eager to leave the bustling city behind. As they set off, Dapo tuned the radio to a station playing Christmas music, hoping it would lift everyone's spirits. They passed through multiple checkpoints, exchanging polite greetings with officers along the way. The journey seemed smooth, the countryside stretching out before them in patches of green and brown. Eventually, they reached a lonely stretch of road lined with thick forest on either side. The Christmas music seemed less cheerful out here, where the world felt empty and silent. Suddenly, 3 men in police uniforms appeared at the side of the road, signaling for them to pull over. Dapo slowed the car and stopped, slightly annoyed but cooperative. One of the officers, Sergeant Musa, approached the driver's side window, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, sir. Where are you headed?" Musa asked, his tone flat. "To the village for Christmas," Dapo replied, trying to keep his tone polite. Musa nodded, his eyes lingering on the family before him. "Do you mind opening the boot?" Dapo hesitated, a spark of irritation flashing in his eyes. "There's nothing in the boot but luggage," he said. "It's a family trip, sir." Bissy, sensing tension, gently touched his arm, urging him to comply. Reluctantly, Dapo stepped out of the car, opened the trunk, and allowed Musa to search through the suitcases filled with clothes and gifts. Finding nothing suspicious, Musa slammed the boot shut and walked back to the window. He examined Dapo's driver's license, looked over the car papers, and found everything in order. But instead of letting them go, Musa leaned in and asked, "Anything for the boys?" Dapo stiffened, his irritation rising to the surface. "Why should I give you money when all my papers are complete?" he demanded, his voice carrying a hard edge. "I'm a Nigerian citizen, and I know my rights." Bissy whispered to him again, begging him to just give the officer a little money to avoid trouble. But Dapo's pride wouldn't allow it. He shot her a look and said, "No, this is the problem with our country. People like him think they can just take whatever they want." Musa's face darkened. "Are you trying to teach me my job, Mr. Man?" His hand rested on the door handle, his tone carrying a dangerous hint of challenge. "Step out of the car." Dapo's defiance flared. "I've done nothing wrong and I'm not going anywhere." A struggle ensued as Musa pulled at the door, and Dapo tried to hold it closed. In the heat of the moment, Musa's finger slipped on the trigger of his rifle. A single gunshot echoed through the quiet road. Blood spread across Dapo's shirt as he slumped in his seat. Bissy and the children screamed, their voices filled with terror and shock. For a moment, everything was still. Musa and the other officers stared, horrified by what had just happened. Panic set in, and without thinking, the officers fled the scene, leaving Dapo's family alone on the deserted road. Bissy, though trembling with shock, managed to pull herself together. She moved Dapo into the passenger seat, covered his wound as best as she could, and took control of the car, speeding to the nearest hospital. They arrived at the hospital just in time, and the doctors rushed Dapo into surgery. For 3 days, Bissy and the children stayed by his side, praying and hoping. Miraculously, Dapo survived, though he was left weakened and filled with rage. On Christmas Day, Dapo was discharged from the hospital. Determined to still make it to the village, they completed the journey, hoping the familiar comfort of home would bring them some peace after the nightmare they'd endured. As they settled into the village, Dapo was stunned to see someone familiar walking down the dusty road. It was Sergeant Musa, dressed casually, laughing with his family. Dapo stared, realization dawning upon him. Musa was from his own village. Even worse, he discovered that Musa was married to Aisha, a childhood friend of BC. The sight of Musa laughing, carefree and unpunished, ignited a deep, burning rage in Dapo. BC sensed his anger and tried to calm him. "Let it go, Dapo. We should be grateful you're alive. Don't do anything that will make things worse." But Dapo couldn't let it go. His pride and fury clouded his judgment, and he vowed to make Musa pay for the pain he'd caused. That night, unable to let go of his anger, Dapo confided in a few trusted friends from the village, telling them what had happened. His friends were equally disgusted by Musa's behavior, and together, they decided to confront him and teach him a lesson. Around midnight, Dapo and his friends stormed Musa's family compound, masked to avoid recognition, pretending to be armed robbers. They broke into the house, dragging Musa out of bed. Aisha woke up, screaming, but the men ignored her as they started beating Musa, venting all their anger and frustration. "Do you think you can get away with shooting me and leaving my family for dead?" Dapo hissed, his fists pounding into Musa's face. Musa tried to defend himself, pleading for mercy, but Dapo's rage only intensified. His friends joined in, and the beating escalated. In the heat of the moment, Musa stopped moving, his body going limp. Aisha fell to her knees, sobbing. "You've killed him. You've killed my husband." Dapo's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't intended to take it this far. His friends urged him to flee before anyone saw them, and they left quickly, leaving Musa's lifeless body on the floor. Heartbroken and consumed with rage, Aisha called her brothers that same night, telling them everything. Before he lost consciousness, Musa had whispered Dapo's name to her, identifying him as the attacker. Aisha's brothers, known in the village for their ruthlessness, vowed to avenge their sister's husband. Meanwhile, Dapo was beginning to realize the gravity of what he had done. He returned home, shaken, and immediately told BC to start packing. "We're leaving tomorrow, first thing in the morning," he said, his voice filled with urgency. BC looked at him, her face etched with worry. "What did you do, Dapo?" "Just pack," he replied, his tone sharp. In the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m., before Dapo and his family could leave, Aisha's brothers and a group of hired thugs stormed their compound. They broke down the door, catching Dapo and BC off guard. The thugs dragged Dapo out of bed, their fists and kicks raining down on him with merciless force. BC woke up to the chaos and tried to intervene, screaming for them to stop, but one of the thugs struck her with the butt of his rifle, knocking her to the floor. Dapo lay on the ground, beaten and broken, unable to protect his wife and children. The thugs, determined to erase all evidence, ransacked the house. They turned on the gas in the kitchen and lit a fire in the living room, creating the illusion of a gas leak. As the flames spread, the thugs retreated, leaving the house to burn with Dapo, BC, and their 3 children trapped inside. The next morning, as villagers gathered around the charred remains of the house, news of the tragedy spread quickly. People whispered about the fire, piecing together the events that had led to this horrific Christmas Day disaster. Meanwhile, back at the city hospital, Sergeant Musa slowly regained consciousness. His vision blurred and his head throbbed, but he could hear the faint beeping of the monitors around him. He tried to sit up and a nurse rushed over, gently pushing him back down. Where am I?" he murmured, his voice weak. "You're in the hospital," the nurse replied. "Your wife brought you in after some men attacked you. You were lucky, Sergeant Musa. We thought you wouldn't make it." Musa's memories started to flood back. The masked men, the brutal beating, the last glimpse of his wife, Aisha, as she screamed for mercy. Then he remembered something else, something vital. In those last moments, he'd whispered a name to her. Dapo. Musa closed his eyes, a deep sense of dread settling over him. He could only imagine what Aisha might have done, blinded by her grief and rage. "I have to speak to my wife," he whispered to the nurse. "Where is Aisha?" The nurse looked at him with sympathy. "She's been here all night, but she left early this morning. She said she had things to take care of." Musa's heart sank as he pieced together what she might have done in the name of vengeance. Back in the village, villagers were gathered around the smoldering remains of Dapo's family home, whispering in shock and horror. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burnt wood. Inside the charred ruins lay the remains of Dapo, Bisi, and their 3 young children, all caught in the flames that had consumed the house before dawn. Neighbors who had known Dapo and Bisi for years were devastated, unable to comprehend the tragedy that had struck so suddenly. Whispers of revenge, pride, and anger floated through the crowd as they discussed the rumors about what had happened between Dapo and Sergeant Musa. Some shook their heads, muttering that Dapo should have listened to his wife Bisi when she had pleaded for him to leave things alone. Others murmured that Musa's corruption had ultimately led to this, starting a chain of events that spiraled out of control. The once peaceful village was now haunted by the memory of a family lost to the flames. Later that morning, Aisha returned to the hospital, her face tear-streaked and filled with regret. She had heard the news of Dapo's family's death, and the reality of what she had done weighed heavily on her shoulders. The fire she'd ignited, the revenge she'd sought, none of it had brought her any peace. Instead, it had left her with a void she could never fill. She entered Musa's hospital room, where he lay awake, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and sadness at seeing her. But as she approached him, he saw something in her face that unsettled him. What did you do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Aisha fell to her knees beside his bed, her sobs quiet but uncontrollable. "They're dead, Musa. Dapo, Bisi. The children. They're gone. I thought you were dead, and I told my brothers. I thought I was avenging you, Musa." Musa's face went pale as the weight of her words hit him. He closed his eyes, overcome with grief and guilt. His anger, his corruption, his choice to flee after shooting Dapo, all of it had led to this terrible end. And for what? A moment of pride, a refusal to let go, and a blind pursuit of revenge had cost so many lives. Over the next few days, the village mourned. The elders gathered the remaining family members of both Dapo and Musa to conduct a ritual of atonement, hoping to cleanse the village of the anger, violence, and darkness that had consumed them. Aisha was haunted by the knowledge of what she had unleashed. She'd thought vengeance would bring her peace, but all it had done was fill her heart with more sorrow than she could bear. She couldn't bring herself to visit the site of Dapo's house, knowing that her actions had resulted in the deaths of 3 innocent children. In the city, Musa was discharged from the hospital, but he was a shadow of the man he'd once been. His job, his pride, his sense of control, all had led to a tragedy that he would never escape. He resigned from the police force and retreated into a quiet life, burdened by the weight of his guilt. In the years that followed, the village spoke of that Christmas day as a tragic reminder of the dangers of pride, anger, and vengeance. Elders told the story to younger generations, warning them of how easily one wrong decision could lead to disaster. It became a tale of caution, told by firelight every Christmas, reminding everyone that pride could be a deadly poison, and that revenge rarely offered the satisfaction it promised. Remember Dapo, who was too proud to listen. Remember Musa, whose corruption started a chain reaction. And remember Bisi and her children, who were innocent but paid the price. The village eventually built a small shrine on the remains of Dapo's home. They planted trees around it, each tree representing a member of the family lost to the flames. It served as a lasting reminder of the lives cut short by pride and vengeance, a warning to future generations to let go of anger and not to allow darkness to cloud their hearts. And every Christmas, villagers would gather by the shrine, placing flowers and whispering prayers, hoping to honor the memory of those who had been lost.